I'm married to a Dutchman, as you know, from Maastricht. One one thing I love is he's very direct in his communication. I don't have to question what he's thinking. I don't have to make assumptions. And I think there's a value to learning from the Dutch in regards to communication style on how to have the hard conversations.
This is a podcast called Walk, Talk, Listen. An attempt to connect people and make this world a bit better by sharing opinions and experiences based on the belief that everyone's perspective is true, albeit partial. My name is Maurice and I would like to welcome you to yet another episode of Walk, Talk, Listen.
Good day, everybody. This is another episode of the podcast Walk, Talk, Listen. And as always, I'm delighted with today's guest who introduced herself. Martine, please go ahead.
Okay, good. Well, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to whoever is
Yes,
listening. First of all, I am going to say that I think this is a brilliant idea of a podcast. So I'm going to put that on the table before I introduce myself. Second of
And I did
all,
not pay you money to say that, right? So.
you did not. I've had the opportunity to listen to friends. Actually,
Mm,
Nyla, I would encourage everyone to listen to Nyla's podcast. I just listened to that a
absolutely.
moment ago and it was brilliant. So Nyla, bravo. The next thing I'm going to mention is I don't have the tendency to talk about myself. So my lack of articulation on self, sharing is maybe challenged. So feel free to show a little bit of grace as I walk through this with you. My name is Martine Miller. I'm currently the president of the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. I'm also on the expert pool for human security solutions that started recently, and then also in support of Peace Track Initiative, which is women peace builders out of Yemen that are looking at feminist foreign policy within the Yemen space, but also in multiple other countries, and they're absolutely amazing. And then a Horn of Africa Peace Institute. So there are a couple of things I'm doing in support of the work in peacemaking and development on a global scale. Uh, a little bit about myself. I was thinking about this earlier. I'm from rural Indiana.
Oh,
And
you
when
are?
people,
Okay.
I am. And when people ask me where I'm from, if I'm traveling, they're like, "You're from India?" And I'm like, "No, I'm from Indiana." Because it's not common that people know much about Indiana. So I come from a town, I would say, of 300 people, give or take a few any given day. Um, and I grew up on a farm in a very rural area. We grew up in cornfields and wheat fields and with cows and horses. And I collected a lot of different animals from the community. Uh, so that was my upbringing. And I was the kid in the community that whenever a farmer had an animal that they didn't feel would make it, they brought it to me. And so I would end up with the runt pig, or I would end up with the rabbits they collected in the fields, or, a dog, and I would be the one to caretake them. So, and just one, you know, thing that I think about a lot is I remember as I was growing up, when I would receive those animals, I would carry them with me everywhere. They were always with me. And my mother at one point said, "Martine, you have to put that animal down because if you don't, it will die." And a couple of years ago, I was telling my daughter about this, and she said, "But Mama, did you feed them?" I don't remember if I did, but I'm pretty sure I did. Um, but that was that's kind of a reflection of my background. And we grew up very close to a Quaker school.
Mhm.
And the Quaker community, the Friends community, had a very important influence on my life. It was the first time in an environment where there wasn't a lot of diversity, where I was exposed to the idea of equality and equity, and also women's voices. Um, that wasn't something that we were very exposed to growing up in a rural community.
Martine, can I ask
Mhm.
you? Um, I assume when you were with that age, you did not have the terminology for it. You have that now.
Right. Exactly.
So, yeah, can you then try to describe what you saw at that moment without using, the language that we would have for it now?
Okay, I'll give you an example. I really enjoyed photography. And so, the school that I was most exposed to is called Earlham College, and that's a Quaker backs it has a Quaker backing, and at that time, I was exploring my photography skills, but I came from a very rural area, and we didn't have a lot of financing behind us to buy a nice camera, so I had more of a point and shoot type of camera. And at one point, I did end up meeting a couple that were working on a Quaker magazine, and they said, "Oh, you like photography. Would you like to be our photographer?" And I remember the feeling I had of I was how excited I was to be invited to do that as a young woman, a young person. I think I was about 16 or 17 at that time. And I remember that feeling of being included. I was incredibly shy and how it felt knowing that I was invited into something where I only had a point and shoot camera. I didn't have this beautiful, elaborate camera that others had. And when I did that, they exposed me to different articles that they were writing on, equality and equity and gender rights, for instance. And I remember being taken back by that because that was something that was never really we weren't exposed to in a community, country community type of school, nor was it something that was really discussed in our family. And so that made a big impact on my
Mm,
life.
mm.
It's more how I felt at those moments and how it inspired me rather than um, recognizing kind of the terminology connected to it.
And do you have
Mhm.
any siblings?
I have an older sister, an older brother, and a younger sister, so I'm the typical middle child.
Okay. And
Mhm.
when you were going there with your camera, you were alone? You were not,
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, and I think there are moments in my life where I feel like those were they might look small and, big picture of an individual's life, but they were pivotal to me. Because I grew up in fields. I played in fields of wheat and corn and in the mud and in streams and catching fireflies. So, though I didn't have that opportunity for those experiences.
Hmm. So, but you did not go into the direction of photography or animals,
Well,
right?
we'll come to that one later because
Yeah.
I've done full circle
Oh,
actually
really?
in a funny way. No, actually, I the way so being from a rural community in
Uh-huh.
Indiana, there's not a lot of exposure to the international, world, right? And so when I was in high school, there were two influences. There was one, um, it was my French teacher, Miss Vertowski. She was Polish by background. Um, and I remember moments where she would dance through the classroom singing French songs to us. Um, and then I had another professor or teacher his name was Mr. Cole, and he was my geography teacher, and he ran the photography club. And he would let me collect out of National Geographic magazines maps. So I would just collect map after map after map that I could, and I was probably the only student that did that. And when it came to photography, he said, "Okay, I'm gonna give you a broad assignment. I want you to be creative with it." And, I would say those were 2 teachers that were the most influential in my life that really inspired me to step out of my home community.
Mm.
I ended up joining an international musical theater that I auditioned for,
Wow.
and that's how I left Indiana. Not by going to college immediately because that wasn't something that was, put on the agenda either as a young person. Um, my way out was essentially, um, auditioning for a musical, and that took me across the United States, took me around Canada. Um, the first time I had the opportunity to really go to Quebec, for instance, and discuss the types of conflicts that were happening within the Canadian space, then around our first, a performance in Ireland up to Belfast during the Troubles. and then over to different locations with across Europe where we also had exposure to what was going on in the Balkans.
You were talking about you use the language, getting out.
Yeah.
Um, was that the case for did your siblings have the same urge, and did they do that, or were you the only
Um,
one?
I think all siblings left. I think that's also a nature of the U.S. in some
Uh,
ways. There's a really very, movement nomadic type of cultural dynamic in the U.S. where people do move, typically across the country, within the country, not necessarily out of the country. Um, my sister ended up going into medical school, my brother into law school, and my little sister into the military. Um, and so everyone chose their different path. Um, and I think a lot of that inspiration to go into into these fields or, move beyond Williamsburg, Indiana, which is an amazing small town community, was inspired by my mother's, love for reading. Um, and I think that that was just inherently something that we picked up on, and it inspired all of us to do something that moved us out of more rural Indiana to other locations across the country or globally.
hmm,
Mhm.
okay, wow.
Mhm.
Okay, tell me a bit about that. Touring, as part
Mhm.
of musical.
Mhm. I actually miss that a lot. So
Mm.
it helps me also. I think it was really important to me to get into the theater because I was incredibly shy. I was a horribly shy little kid where my mother would take us to the local country store and she would say, Martine, you have to get out of the car and buy your own ice cream. You go ask for it and you buy it and I'll give you the money. And I would go into the store and I would stand at the counter and peep over the counter and I would walk away. So my brothers and sisters would get an ice cream, but I wouldn't get an ice cream because I was horribly shy. So the theater was really good for me in that respect. So I joined my high school theater, I joined the community theater in Richmond, Indiana, and then from that I had exposure to more like musical elements to the theater. Um, and that I think the arts, and particularly with the work that I do today, you see the arts that it's profound in bringing community together and inspiring and feeding the kind of when you're talking about like internal development, feeding the soul in a lot of ways. So a lot of what we did was with our musical work, it was a lot of understanding the communities we engaged in. We would have multiple shows in one day. We worked almost every day during the month, had about 2 days off a month, and then during those times, if anyone wanted to, we could go and volunteer in the communities and get to know communities that we were performing in, and, I think the volunteering in those communities that we were performing in really made a difference in the life that I chose to move toward in a lot of ways in regards to community peace building. Um
And what was the musical about?
it depended, it changed
Oh,
every
okay,
type,
okay.
so we would often change it to context.
Hmm.
And sometimes, I mean, there was a point to where we were in Europe and in Northern Ireland, and some of the performance would be more about community building and peace
Hmm.
building elements to it, which, that at that time, I didn't have a full understanding of, nor did the other members of the cast, because most people came on board because they were passionate about musical, like theater and music. And then I think it was me and another person named Robin Ronmakers actually and I'll have to share this with him. He's a journalist in Belgium,
Hmm.
he spends a lot of his time going to different conflict zones and reporting on different conflict zones. So two of us really kind of took that path of community engagement, understanding, what was going on in different countries and different regions, um, and how do we kind of engage more effectively in those spaces. And that I think was predominantly a part of that was predominantly from being in the theater and working within the communities that we worked on and the focuses that we had there.
Fascinating. Um, so how long did you do that for?
I think if I don't think of things in time of kind of the time, I think of them in regards to kind of the succession of things. So I think that was about a year, maybe a little bit over a
Okay.
year. And then when I was in Germany, I ended up volunteering in a center where there were refugees from the Balkans.
Mm.
And from that experience, also from the Northern Ireland experience in Belfast, um, I realized, where my passion really, uh, the center of my passion would be is working really closely with communities on um, conflict types of developments within their communities that tore them apart, where they didn't expect it to happen as it did. So after that, I ended the work with the theater, and then I went into living in on the board of Israel Palestine and working on the arts there as well with young people.
Mm. And when you think back about, when you realized,
Hmm.
okay, that's what I would like to do, that's my passion. Was there a moment, or was it a series of moments, or was it a gradual, did it develop? Do you still
You
recall
know,
that?
I think it was a series of moments, but I think it was inherent to who I was. I just didn't know what it was because I didn't have that exposure to it. So when I was little collecting, when I was in high school and collecting the um the maps and being inspired by Miss Rotowski and, her passion for the French language, I knew there was something inherent to that, but I didn't know what it was. We just didn't have that type of exposure in my community.
Okay. So, when you decided to volunteer in Germany, was that at the same time where you were doing performances, or
Mhm.
you left the musical?
It was at the same time. It was we would have
Okay.
time off
Oh,
from
that was the time. Okay,
yeah,
I
from our
understand.
and anytime we had time off, I either tried to rest or I would
Uh-huh.
try to make sure that I did something within the community. And I think having those moments within the community, particularly, I think the biggest two impacts were having had the opportunity to be in Belfast
Uh-huh.
and experience what was happening within Belfast, and then also within Germany, where I had the opportunity to work closely with people fleeing conflict, and I had never had that type of exposure before.
Mm, okay.
Mhm.
But, yeah, allow me to make a jump, because if I look at your bio, your academic career, journey is incredible. So many degrees. So take us through that. How did that happen?
Well, let me just reflecting back so as soon as I left the theater, I went to the Israel Palestine space. After that, I applied. I don't know if you've heard of AmeriCorps. It's kind of like the National
Mm-hmm.
Peace
Yes.
Corps.
Uh-huh.
And so from Israel Palestine in the Middle East, I traveled to Alaska. And
Mm,
I worked there with AmeriCorps for a year in Juneau, Alaska, and that was working with young people on, environment, stream restoration projects. After that, I applied for another position that took me to Angola during the war. So I was at in the beginning, I knew I wanted to work in service to communities and work
uh-huh.
closely with communities, but I didn't know what that was exactly. So I when I went to Angola, I lived in a place called Tambwa, which was an area where there were a lot of IDPs from the war. And so we worked a lot
Internally displaced
persons.
persons, people.
Yes.
Yeah, just for the listeners,
Okay.
IDPs. Yeah.
Yeah. And then children affiliated with armed forces. So there
Mm.
was a high percentage in Angola of children affiliated with armed forces at that time. Um, and so as soon as I went to Angola, that really put me on the track and almost typecasted me for a role of working in conflict, and peace building. And then at that time, I had the opportunity to work on the conversations that were starting around the peace process in Angola, uh, prior to the end of the conflict. And the conflict ended for different reasons than the peace process, but it was a step into those spaces and how negotiation, mediation took place, and how diplomacy, backroom diplomacy, worked. From that experience, that's when I went to university, and so I returned back to Indiana, which is Bloomington, and knew I wanted to study like intersection of politics, international law, and development. And my passion was very much Africa. Um, just a history of what was happening with at that time, the Zaire history to DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, the Rwandan genocide, and then a lot of my studies I focused on atrocity prevention and genocide um, response. And that took me into my master's program and looking at international law and atrocity prevention and response.
Yeah. If
Mhm.
if um if I ask you, okay, you have been in so many different situations, if I ask you to come up with one example, to share with us that would give a good picture of what your work is about and what you're trying to do, which example would you share?
Well, that's a good question. There are a lot of different. Um, I would say I'll share an earlier one,
Hmm.
and then something impartial that we're doing now. Um, that I can share some of, but not everything, because of the security around it. But the importance of it. And one being, I'll start with the previous one. I had the opportunity to work closely with colleagues on Libya, very close colleagues and friends. They almost became family members. And one thing that we worked on was what is the role, like after the fall of Gaddafi, what was the role of civil society in peacemaking within the country? Because in Libya, a lot was framed around Gaddafi. Life was framed around Gaddafi. And so, um, what role do tribal actors, what role do religious actors, youth actors, and women actors play in advancing Libya to peace and, positive peace and development? And so at that time, we worked, I think, over 70 different leads of the different tribes across the three regions. And then many religious actors. We brought into the fold women leaders, and then along with that, key youth leaders. And so the conversation was really, what is the current, the more like kind of the immediate and the future of Libya, and how do you see that happening, and what role do you have in that happening? Like, what role do you play as key actors, and how do you form a collective collaboration to achieve that? And so what was developed was kind of basically a network of different actors where they would come together and they said, okay, we want to develop a network amongst us. And we want to start with identifying three areas that we need to work on ourselves with any type of, support to achieve our goal of a social contract for Libya. Because when Gaddafi fell, there were different types of conflicts happening between the regions, and that they were trying to figure out how to resolve those for a more peaceful future. And so they picked three different areas: one as an easy lift, one as a more moderate lift, and a one as a harder lift, to be able to see what they could achieve together. And um, that was a collective agreement among kind of key lead actors across the country. Now, an interesting thing about that was, and this will go into a youth point, is when we were working with the leads of tribal and religious leaders, we wanted to make sure that there was inclusive engagement of women voices, because one of the things I see in every place I've had the opportunity to kind of live or experience or engage and support and stand in solidarity with is women's networks are very strategic in their thinking and in their engagement within the community. And so we wanted to make sure that women leaders were a key part of that because they were vital to that. And then youth leaders and youth actors being vital to that because of them being the current and the future of the country. And when we brought in the women leaders, we had initially thought it's going to be a harder engagement to get them to all work together. And in fact, they were like, listen, we all have, constituents. We all have this common goal. And how do we achieve it together? And so that kind of collaboration really formed rather quickly and successfully. The more challenging part of that was bringing in the young people. And the reason for that was when the young people were brought in, it was both sides of, the more elder community and the young people blaming the other for the conflicts that they were seeing. And so it took quite a bit of time and emotion to move that forward. But as soon as we achieved that full collaboration together, young people stepped in and said, listen, our capacities, you have your capacity in regards to your coalitions, your constituents. We can bring in, for instance, technical capacity where we have the capacity to put this on social media. We have the capacity to really blast this information out so that more and more people learn about it. And we become, in essence, they became the first movers, right? Where then by sharing out what was happening among this network, it inspired more critical mass people to be more interested in what they were doing and to show up and do things in collaboration. So that's one example.
I,
Um,
I,
mhm,
before you go to the second, I made a couple of quick notes.
mhm,
So to help to clarify, yeah, fascinating. I mean, first of all, but how do you? Because you mentioned about different tribes. So I assume they speak different language. So how do you go about it? You are not from that area,
mhm.
and so of all those places where you go, you speak the language, um, and then you talk about we. So what does that mean? And how, why would they then listen to you or trust you in, I assume you're trying to facilitate this to bring groups together. How do you go about it?
Well, on the language point, I wish that I could speak a lot of languages. I wish I had that background. That's one other thing about being, raised in rural Indiana. Language skills aren't something, and I think that's another thing within the U.S. space is language skills aren't seen as something that's incredibly vital, and so you're not raised in the environment where language is important. My background is French, more French language, and some Dari. I've tried to learn Burmese and Thai, and I have not been incredibly successful with it. I wish I had been. Um, but one thing that I work a lot on in regards to language is it's always in language that everyone feels comfortable in. And then if there's translation needs, then that translation comes to me rather than everyone being, having to speak English and then people being excluded because they don't have the English capacity. It's my failure to not be speaking Arabic, for instance. It's a detriment to me, not to others. So usually the language is always in the language that we're working in. We're all working in. Um, the next part is we. I have a tendency to. My approach usually to work is to take off my hat of an organization. So I usually don't bring in the concept of, oh, this is ICRD or this is Chula University or this is, a specific organization. I look at it from a perspective of we're all working on this together and how do we achieve it? And what can I bring to the table that will help that happen? Sometimes it's just coordinating and helping facilitation. So bringing in a coordination facilitation skill set that is helpful to make sure that all voices are heard, for instance, could be one role. And a lot for the work on Libya was predominantly that is how do we ensure everyone is sitting at the table in a safe space to feel confident in their voices being heard. And so that was predominantly the role that I played. Um, the question of people often ask me, "You're not from these locations. You're from rural Indiana. You're not speaking the language. You're female in some situations. And how does that play out?" And one of the things that I've experienced, I I think a big part of the success of it is I am coming from more of a or neutral or partial to being successful in regards to peacemaking, role and experience that's not threatening. Um, and so I've been in a lot of different spaces where trust has been vital to those roles. Um, and so that trust building has been kind of a natural part of who I am because I'm inherently interested and curious about people and their life experiences.
Hmm.
And I think coming with that curiosity and a non-judge oftentimes people worry about judgment or, someone from another country not understanding the context. I ask a lot of questions. So I present myself as very curious, of which I am. And I think that really helps with that trust building angle of things. So it's been helpful. In fact, for Sudan, I was contacted. I lived in Sudan, worked in, Sudan and then South Sudan, Northern Uganda, and Eastern Congo and Rwanda. And I was contacted over 2 years ago again on Sudan, and friends said, "Martine, we need you to come here and help with this." And I said, "But I actually know a really good Sudanese contact and colleague that would be excellent with this." And they're like, "No, no, no, we need you to do that." And it has a lot to do with this sense of people feeling safe in these conversations and in the work that you're doing, and that it's there's not an ego applied to it or someone wants to be competitive or capture something specific for themselves. There's not a greediness to the angle. I don't know if I explained that well
Mm.
enough, um, but I
Oh
think
no,
that's key.
you did.
Mhm,
I know you wanted to give a second example. Um, yeah, having said that, I also would like to understand more about the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy. So maybe you
mhm.
can weave it together. Is that possible or not?
Yep, perfect. I
Okay.
think the second example fits that nicely, and that's
Okay.
I'm doing a lot of work in support of Sudan and in service to the Sudan developments, and also we're working on Syria. So the International Center for Religion and Diplomacy is essentially a center that was started at over 28 years ago by an individual named Doug Johnston, and he was the youngest nuclear submarine captain. And, from his life experience, he really felt like this is, before religion and identity became a point in some of these conversations. He talked about and he wrote a book called Religion, The Missing Piece of Statecraft. And at that point, in that time, governments really didn't when a lot of people, I mean, in this field didn't want to touch or broach the conversation around religion. But religious identity it can be quite fluid, but religious identity, ethnic, all of these different gender, language connections, all of these different identities all combine in an individual and they're significant. And by missing that meant that there was something very significantly lost in peace processes. And so the organization was started. It's very small and nimble. And I actually like the size of the organization and the mandate of the organization because we can maneuver in spaces that others can't, given their mandates. So, for instance, on Sudan, I work very closely with people that are directly engaged in the conflict and on the conversations of the conflict, and particularly religious actors that are key to their communities who are at the forefront of the front lines of the communities where they're working on making sure the community has health care, how their community gets food access, water, education. So I work closely with those religious actors and some of the key actors in those conversations across the different divided parties, and then communicate with individuals in government spaces that are not necessarily not that don't necessarily have access to those same individuals or would not be able to pursue access with them. I become the person that works across these different individuals to bring information to so everyone has a common understanding of what the needs are, the wants, and the interest for the communities involved in the conflict. Um, so that's one example of
Uh-huh.
some of the things that we're doing. Another is some of it. It's hard to talk about because of the sensitivity to it.
Mhm.
One other is there's a project we're working on that is really very much looking at um, human security in a sensitive location where there's more and more detrimental impact on women.
Mhm.
And so we are in conversations with individuals that have the leverage to be able to make a change and to improve the lives of half of the population within the country.
Mm.
Um, so some of them are sensitive to talk about.
Yeah, yeah. No, I understand.
Yeah,
Yeah.
I actually go back to Asia next week. I leave on Thursday. We're working very closely on the Burma
Mm.
dynamics and humanitarian corridors and humanitarian access for supplies and healthcare and mental health support and documentation um, on Burma.
Mm. If it just you use the word nimble, so
Mhm.
how big, how small is
Well,
is
it
is the center?
depends. It depends on
Yeah.
all that we're working on. Of course, the dynamics around funding are always,
Uh-huh.
challenging. So at the moment, we have a small team. We have 5 to 6 people that work with us, and we're working on Syria, Yemen, Sudan, Burma, more and more on the Ukraine, the U.S. space, because of developing polarization within the country
Mhm.
that is um, that is showing up as a concern for what that might look like in the future and in the immediate future. Um, so it's quite a small team. We carry a large load with us on our shoulders. It's is a spectacular group of people that really are driven and passionate about the field of work that we're working in.
Okay, and we'll make sure that we
Hmm.
put the website in the podcast notes so then people can check out more about your work. Martine, I would like to piggyback on what you said, um, polarization, especially within this country. So, if you would be asked to facilitate, to mediate um, within this country,
Mhm.
so you said, okay, you're doing certain things, but let's go, in the House and in the Senate where people aren't working together. How would you go about it?
Okay, let me see how I'm gonna have to figure out how to frame this in a way. 'Cause you've got a this is a sensitive topic too. Um, I'll start with something really quick. I wanna kind of give a little bit of a foundation to this. I think so just back to I grew up in rural Indiana. We didn't have a lot of diversity in rural Indiana. You grow up with you're taught if you're a hard worker, you're a good person. And if you're working hard, you're working a job in a factory, you're working at a restaurant at night or on the weekends, and then you are taking care of your children and you're farming at night, you're working hard and you're still trying to make it, right? You have a car accident, you break your leg, you get into massive debt financially because of the health needs around that and that you've missed work. So I'm a hard worker. It can't be me that isn't meeting up to the roles and responsibilities that I have, and I must be a good person. So what's the challenge here? So I think one of the things that's happened within the country is there's got to be a reason. So we've created the other, as a reason. And the other changes depending on the time, the day, the year. You even see it in movies where accents in movies change over time. At one point, it was a Middle Eastern accent. Then it changed to a French accent. Then it changed to a Russian accent. There's always got to be the other that then frames it as, well, I'm struggling, but why? And I need to understand that. And then that comes into, the self-reflection. If we talk about that later, I think the country struggled with that for quite a long time. And I think having that conversation around what are the structural elements within our country that we need to improve is really important. And to have those open conversations. When I grew up, we were basically said, it was the underlying tone that sits within the country. Don't talk about politics and religion at the table. Let's brush that under the carpet. If we don't have the hard conversations, then we can never work through what we need to work through as a community, as a family, as a country. So I think progressively having these dialogues within communities is really, really vital. We have to be open to having those conversations. Now, I know you're from originally, like your background is partly Dutch. Is that correct?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm married to a Dutchman, as from Maastricht. One
Yeah.
one thing I love is he's very direct in his communication. I don't have to question what he's thinking. I don't have to make assumptions. And I think there's a value to learning from the Dutch in regards to communication style on how to have the hard conversations. And we need to do that. And so I think we're at a point where we do need to bring people around smaller tables in communities and have those hard conversations. One link to that, I know I'm jumping a little bit, but one link to that is a couple of years ago, I ended up studying to be an EMT and then an advanced EMT. Where it's fascinating to me.
So sorry,
Mhm.
Martine, just because we have global
Yeah.
listeners. EMT.
Okay. It's emergency medical technician and
Hmm.
then advanced emergency medical technician. And that means that I lead the ambulance. So I'm in the seat of the ambulance when we have a call out. We go to a community member's home at their worst moment possibly, and we assist them medically, and we transport them the in the ambulance to the hospital, and so we maintain their lives throughout that time if needed.
Okay, thank you.
Um, but the interesting thing about being a volunteer in that space is that when I walk into the fire and rescue station, everyone's there because they care about their community. They might come from different political backgrounds. They might come from different, parts of the area. They might come from different religious beliefs, and they're all there sitting around the table, and they get woken up in the night. They're sleep deprived, all of these things, um, in service to the community. So to me, it's how do we better reflect an environment like that, like the fire and rescue stations in our community any day of the week, and know that we're there for each other, know that we want a stronger community, a stronger, region within our area, and a stronger country. And I think by critically looking at that it's not being non-patriotic, it's being patriotic from my perspective. Because we want to do better and we want to be better.
Okay,
Mhm,
I want to, and I know we talked a bit about this also when you and I met during the Interface Forum, the G20 that was held in Cape Town recently. But if we look at the global challenges that we have, so not only in the US but the global challenges,
mm,
um, we identified a number of years ago already. We have challenges, and as a result, we came up with 17 Sustainable Development Goals to make our world more sustainable and just. That might not be perfect, but we are not reaching those goals we are only at 15, on average, 15 to 17%, and some are, getting worse. Um, and now a growing group of people have said that, one of the reasons that we are not reaching those goals, so that we are not making the system changes and structure changes that are required to reach those goals, is that because we did not pay attention to the ability, skills, and knowledge that you need as an individual as well as a community. And they came up with 5 inner development goals. And I know
Mhm.
you're aware: being, thinking, relating, collaborating, and acting. Is that what you're talking about? That needs to happen? Pay attention as well to the inner development, skills like empathy, critical thinking.
Absolutely, and I think the interesting thing about it is, I think young people and children still have that within them. I think, working with young people for a long time, we worked on the Youth Peace and Security agenda when it was formed, as a group of people that really pushed on, the Youth Peace and Security 2250, within the secure passed by the Security Council and then within the UN. If you look at I have 2 little kids. I have a 10-year-old and a 7-year-old, and of course, they have the world of me, and then but they still have this sense of what is just, and an element of empathy and thoughtfulness that for some reason, as adults, sometimes we lose. And so in some ways, when people say when people will say, "Oh, you're acting like a child," I'm like, "Oh, if only," right? I think we do need to get back to that. I think we need to get back to the idea of understanding and growing within ourselves, reflecting, and at the same time showing another person grace, because we all go through different things. Like, I don't know what you experienced prior to getting on the call with me today. And it could have been that your cat ran out the door and you're devastated that you've lost your cat. That could, I mean, just it could be something like my mother passed away 2 years ago, and that's been a persistent challenge for me. We don't know what people are living through. So I think it's that self-reflection, that intercare, and then that grace showing it to others. And at the moment, what we're seeing, not in the US space, and I think also a lot of locations we've worked, is that othering where we don't show that grace. And I'd love to understand that more
Uh,
personally. I'm really interested in the neuroscience behind it, because there's a neuroscience angle of it with, fight flight elements, um, that we all have a tendency to fall into. But I think that's a key to impact,
uh.
is that interdevelopment is key to the impact that we hope to see in the world.
Maybe, at least I think one of the first, or an important part of this could be trying to connect people so that they start to understand each other better, and then dialogue will take place. Now, in my podcast, I'm trying to connect you with the listeners. We are connected. I'm going to connect you with the previous guest. And the previous guest has a question for you, actually, 2 questions.
How do we move from awareness to action? We are aware of all the SDG, from MDGs to SDGs. How do we move away from rhetorics to practice? How do we identify systemic barriers and become real change agents? It is time to become change agents. We have all the ideas of development. How do we become actors, doers, rather than theorists? That is my question. And this is an existential question for all of us as human beings. So we want ideas on how to translate policy into practice, how to become moral voice agents, and how to be instruments of impactful change and social missions that will enhance lives and livelihoods all across. That is my question. So probably you may also add when. How and when do we do this? The time is now. Tell us how we can do it.
Yeah,
Mhm.
a tough one, but you want to
Who
give it a
who
try?
was who was the previous person?
I'm normally not telling you,
Your dad. Okay.
but you can find it out when you go Google it, right? But
Okay. I'll Google it. That's a good. Those are good questions. And what I know this is going to sound. I'm going to err on the side of silly here. Um, have you seen the second Frozen movie?
no,
I do.
I've heard about it, but my wife is a school teacher, kindergarten. So
So I watched the second Frozen
hmm
movie with my children,
yeah,
and there's a point where I think her name is Anna. I'm not gonna I'm not gonna give the movie away because you haven't seen it. There's a point in the movie where she's lost everything for her. And she's sitting there in despair and she starts singing a song. And I often sing this song to people. It's about the next right step. I think at the moment we're in a time where things are so confusing. Many people that I've spoken to have said, do we wait for the dust to settle? How do we approach things? What do we do? Um, I think it's about taking the next right step. So there's a lot we know in regards to theory because there's been tons of research done. Where I find that we're missing is knowing exactly what to do. And I think we get lost in that long term vision sometimes, particularly in confusing times. So my push is okay, it's a hard time, but as an individual, as an organization, as a community, as a country, what is our next right step in these confusing times? And that can simply be being present in your community and saying in your community, hey, I'm going to have a roundtable at the local coffee shop. Come join me. And I know the Danes started something called Human Library, which I think is brilliant. And I was a human library person in Geneva at the UN. There was a UN summit at one point. And I think that's a brilliant idea. Doing something like that in your community where individuals sit down and they basically become a human library in a space where they talk about their lives to be able to break down those divisions that we're seeing within our communities. Those are very practical next steps. So I think there's that one thing of the next right step that Anna sings about personally, because I think we get I think people don't I think what I am experiencing, I've experienced it myself, is there's so much going on that it's hard to see the impact, but I can tell you in my life, I've had individuals step in and out of my life where I will forever remember them for even saying something small to me when I was having a hard time. So that I think it makes a huge impact in your communities. And it
mm.
might not be, the role that Nelson Mandela played or Desmond Tutu or Martin Luther King, but it's important to your neighbor or it's important to, somebody struggling. So I would say that's how you think about kind of linking that theoretical to the action on a very human level.
Your question for the next guest.
My question for the next guest. I had an idea and then I just completely forgot it. So let me see what I wrote down. Um, my n- my next guest question would be um, share about one time um, you changed your mind about something important and what practice or relationship made that possible and how has it shaped you today? Because I think sometimes what we do is we have our mind set on something and we zero in on that and that makes us feel safe. And then there are times where something influences us and we're like, "Oh, I didn't think about that." So can I give you a really quick example on that?
Yes, please.
Okay. At one point we were doing when there was a lot of division among communities in South and Southeast Asia. it was very much framed around identity, like religious identity. And we were working very closely in analyzing the Rohingya crisis in Burma. The So we ended up bringing together religious actors from across South and Southeast Asia into kind of a phased fellowship approach. In the first meeting where we brought fellows together, we brought very young people and then very senior people. And a lot of times in a space like that, younger people will be silent in the room with their seniors. At the end of the first day, there was a young novice monk from Burma that stood up. And we had Buddhist, Christian, Muslim, Hindu, um, atheist, different types of community religious actors engaged. And he stood up as a young person, was quiet most of the day, stood up as a young person, and he said, "I want to say I'm sorry to my Muslim friends here." And he explained why. He said, "I have never in my life had the opportunity to meet someone that was Muslim. But all I've heard in my community was the danger of a person, in our community that was Muslim. We used to throw," he said, "we used to throw pork ribs after we ate them at the mosque as kind of to show our disdain for our Muslim community members." And he said, "I'm very sorry for that." And he said, "I'm really thankful for having had this opportunity to meet, my Muslim friends and to get to know you all." And I think just having those moments of like those experiences can make a very impactful change. And now he's really engaged in interfaith engagement across South and Southeast Asia. Mhm.
Yeah, thank you
Mm.
for sharing that story, Martine. Um, Time goes fast, and there are a couple of questions that I would like to ask you. Um, yeah, one is, and the listeners know this, music is important for me, and I really heard you also clearly that the arts are an important part of all those different things that we do, and also of your work. My question about music is, if I ask you to come up with a piece of music or a song that best embodies what you are about for a big part, which song or piece of music would that be, and why?
And you've already said, this is a hard question. And this is a harder question for me because I am the biggest nerd when it comes to music. And as a little insight information, I hoard musical instruments. So my husband's like, "Martine, you brought another instrument home with you." Um, I would say just to make it easy, I selected "Stand By Me," and it's because of I think we often grow up in a very individualistic society, and the importance of standing with each other in solidarity and community is really essential to what I think is possible in our world. Imagine if we all committed ourselves to standing in a community with each other, how amazing this world would be. That would just be, I can't even begin to imagine what we could do together. So that would be mine. But there are numerous
Great,
more I would put on the table.
great. Thank you. I one quick question, because I do think that that song has been selected already, so it's part of a playlist that or we made on Spotify. If you go to Spotify and you search for hashtag Walk Talk Listen, all the songs that have been selected are there. Um, but maybe you have a specific rendition.
I have to let me look. Well, there was actually, I think it was out of the Netherlands. There's a really interesting organization that brings musicians together and what they do is they play songs together and they do the videos where there's a person standing in Amsterdam, and then there's a person in South Africa, and they're
Mm.
playing different instruments, and they each sing kind of different parts of the lyrics, and they connect it
I
all
think
together.
I've seen that.
Yeah.
Okay, I will search for it if it is on Spotify or not.
Mhm.
Um, okay, thank you. Um, okay, I have two more questions actually. One is just, you know I mean, I have uh, 2 or 3 medical doctors, maybe even 4 previously in my family. And what I've learned is, and they're great medical doctors, all of them. But from medical doctors in general, they always say, but don't ask them to treat their own family members. Is that the case for peacemakers as well? Then, for the work that you do,
Oh,
how is it
too.
within your family if there are quarrels? Are you a good
Well,
are you as good outside of your house as well as inside?
that's we've talked about that. Okay, this is gonna sound bad. So when I first met my husband, we actually we met because he organized a security training for us in the northern Netherlands in bulk, and he kidnapped me in the training, right? So my
Yeah.
background was always like how to, negotiate and mediating types of things. And so there's a lot of psychological elements to the work that we do. And it's about some of it's neuroscience related, right? So this is going to sound bad. And I'm sure he knows it at this point, but I've practiced skills on him in regards to like that neuroscience element, understanding who he is. How do I have a conversation in a way that can help with the negotiated like conflict? One thing I say in the family is conflict is good. It's good to have conflict. And the reason it's good to have conflict is then you work together to overcome what that conflict is, and it makes you closer. It builds relationship. Conflict is only negative when it goes in a violent psychological, physical way. And so if we argue about something, I don't see I see that as a positive because I just learn more about my husband and my children. And the interesting thing is our kids are, I don't know if it just comes off on them. They teach us a lot. Like they're like, "You're arguing," and they started creating, songs. If we argue, they'll stop us and they'll sing this song about conflict that they've created. Um, so I conflict is present everywhere. I don't see that as a problem as long as it doesn't go in a negative
I
way. Yeah.
Okay, I think
Mhm.
what I should do is interview your husband and your kids to get the right answer about this, um, or at least another perspective. Martine, yeah, I sent you more questions than we um, that we were covering today, but I
Mhm.
really appreciate your willingness to talk with me, especially
Mhm.
because you're still jet lagged. I continue to push you. Yeah, we will talk this week, and we did. Is there any question though that I should have asked you, but I didn't today?
Um, I I would think, I was on a call earlier this morning on, it's with the Harvard Humanitarian Initiative, and they're looking at autonomous, like AI. Um, and so it was a big conversation around that. And one of the things I put on the table is I said, "This is amazing that that you're working with negotiators to understand the use of AI and which direction it's going and how to use it for positive. Can we look at mistakes that we've made?" And I think this is one of the other reasons I like the Netherlands a lot because the Netherlands, the government actually ended up really wanting to understand any of the work that they had done on an international scale, any mistakes that were made. So they did, a publication on that, which I think is brilliant. And they also ask that. I mean, if you're working closely with them, they ask, where were your key mistakes, and what did you learn from those? And so I think that's always a good question because there's a lot of learning that happens with mistakes, I
Okay.
would say. Mhm.
Okay, I'm not going to ask you to answer your that particular question. Maybe we will talk about that the next time we meet. Yeah, thank you so much for today, and thank you for your willingness to be my human library for the last hour or so.
My
Um,
pleasure.
Keep doing what you do, and yeah, thank you for who you are, and all the best.
Thank you for the invitation. And, I wish I had known about your walk many, many years ago, as I shared earlier. But if you need a person in solidarity where they're walking 100 miles too, and you can WhatsApp chat or something like that, I am your person.
And thank you for mentioning that because I hope still to do it this year. So it's going to be, if everything goes well, it's a little bit crazy because I September is going to be crazy, but in October as well. But I hope in the last week of October to do the 100-mile walk in 5 days. But I hope that um, people that I've talked with, since 2020 in my podcast, I think, or 2021, um, that they will also walk 100-mile in the month of October, so they don't have to do it in 5 days, and then pick maybe, the cause that I am trying to support, or your own cause, and because I think showing some, this is the kind of a possibility to show some solidarity and some love towards each other. And I think we can turn around whatever is going on at the moment. So I believe in that. So I also believe, I have a question about that, right? In the, what I often ask people, and it's Steve Hartman of CBS, who's looking at one simple act of kindness and its potential to create a ripple effect. I really believe in that myself. So thank you so much and all the best.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Walk, Talk, Listen. Please check us out on 100mile.org or follow us on Facebook or Instagram.